In today's story, we follow Nathan, a grieving police officer who finds an abandoned boy clutching two infant twins in the middle of a storm. What begins as a simple rescue transforms into a life-changing journey of love, justice, and redemption as Nathan and his wife, Emma, open their hearts and homes to these children. Along the way, they uncover the dark secrets of a corrupt orphanage, leading to a courageous fight for justice and the creation of a new family filled with hope. Before we dive into this gripping tale of resilience, compassion, and the power of family, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this heartwarming and inspirational story, don't forget to subscribe. Nathan adjusted his patrol car's windshield wipers, struggling to see through the heavy downpour that blanketed the small town. The rhythmic thudding of the wipers matched the ache in his chest, a dull, constant reminder of the life he had lost. The streets, usually quiet on rainy afternoons, seemed even more desolate, as if reflecting the emptiness inside him. Since the death of his young son, Nathan had thrown himself into his work, using it as an escape. It was the only thing that gave him structure amid the chaos of grief. His wife, Emma, was a shadow of her former self, locked in a cycle of despair that he couldn't break through. The once warm and lively home they had shared now felt like a mausoleum, silent and heavy with unspoken pain. Nathan's uniform, once a source of pride, now felt like a burden. Every day, putting it on was a reminder of the weight he carried, not just as a police officer, but as a father who had failed to protect his child. He couldn't let go of the guilt, even though everyone around him told him there was nothing he could have done. The crackling voice of the police radio interrupted his spiraling thoughts, but he barely registered the words. Patrolling the rain-soaked streets was usually a quiet task, free from the drama and chaos that sometimes marked his shifts. He preferred it that way. Calm was easier than confronting the storm within himself. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the empty streets. For a moment, Nathan thought he saw a figure standing on the sidewalk, but the image disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared. He slowed the car and squinted through the rain. There it was again, a small silhouette. Nathan's heart raced as he pulled the car to a stop and stepped out, the rain instantly soaking his uniform. Standing there, trembling and drenched, was a boy no older than 8. The child was clutching two tiny bundles, one in each arm. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The boy turned his face toward him, and Nathan felt an ache that cut through his core. Those eyes, wide, innocent but filled with a sadness far too deep for someone so young, reminded him of his own son. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "Are you okay?" Nathan asked gently, crouching down to the boy's level. His voice wavered more than he intended. The boy hesitated, looking at Nathan with a mixture of exhaustion and distrust. He clutched the two bundles tighter, and Nathan realized they were infants, two tiny, shivering babies. Nathan's sense of urgency grew. The children were soaked through, their tiny faces pale and drawn. The boy's thin arms trembled as if he'd been holding them for far too long. "What's your name?" Nathan tried again, keeping his voice calm and steady despite the storm inside him. "Jamie," the boy finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Jamie, are these your siblings?" Nathan gestured to the babies. Jamie nodded, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I don't know what to do," he said, his voice breaking. Nathan felt a pang of helplessness. The boy's words weren't just about that moment. They carried the weight of someone who had been lost for a long time. "Where are your parents?" Nathan asked carefully, though he dreaded the answer. "I don't have any," Jamie replied, his voice flat. Nathan's chest tightened. He wanted to wrap all 3 of them in his arms. He had to shield them from the cold and the cruel world that had left them abandoned. But he knew he had to stay calm for their sake. "It's going to be okay," Nathan said softly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. He gently reached out, and Jamie allowed him to take the babies from his arms. They were startlingly light, their tiny bodies cold to the touch. "We need to get you somewhere warm," Nathan said, leading Jamie toward the patrol car. The boy followed without protest, his steps shaky and uneven. As Nathan settled the children into the back seat, he felt a flood of emotions overwhelm him. The sight of them, so vulnerable, so fragile, brought back memories of his son's last days in the hospital. The same helplessness, the same desperate need to protect. He climbed into the driver's seat, glancing at Jamie through the rearview mirror. The boy stared out the window, his face blank but his eyes haunted. Nathan gripped the steering wheel tightly, a silent vow forming in his mind. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let these children down. The rain continued to hammer down as Nathan pulled into the station parking lot. He glanced back at the 3 children, who sat huddled in silence. Jamie kept his head down, one hand clutching the edge of Nathan's jacket as if afraid to let go. The twins, wrapped tightly in the dry blankets Nathan had found in the trunk, were finally asleep, their tiny faces peaceful despite the chill in the air. Nathan felt an overwhelming sense of urgency as he carried the babies inside. The warmth of the station was a welcome relief from the cold rain, but it did little to ease the tension in his chest. A duty officer, Maria, hurried over the moment she saw him. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes widening at the sight of the children. "I found them out in the rain," Nathan replied, his voice steady but his heart racing. This boy, Jamie, was carrying these 2 babies. They were abandoned. Maria quickly took one of the twins from his arms, cradling the infant gently. "They're freezing. We need to get them checked out." Nathan nodded, watching as Maria and another officer carefully set up a makeshift space in the break room where the twins could be kept warm until paramedics arrived. Jamie, however, refused to leave Nathan's side. "Come here," Nathan said softly, crouching down to meet Jamie's eyes. "We're going to take care of your sisters, I promise, but I need your help to understand what happened." "Can you talk to me?" Jamie hesitated, his small hands gripping the edges of his soaked sweater. His eyes darted around the room, wary of the unfamiliar faces. Nathan could see the conflict in the boy's expression, wanting to trust but held back by fear. "It's okay," Nathan reassured him. "You're safe now." Finally, Jamie nodded. Nathan led him to a quiet corner and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. He crouched down again, keeping his voice calm. "Can you tell me how you ended up out there? Where were you before?" Jamie stared at the floor, his thin frame trembling under the blanket. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "A woman brought us here," he said, his words halting. Nathan frowned. "A woman? Who was she?" Jamie's fingers tightened around the blanket. She was from the place where we lived, the orphanage. She left us there and didn't come back." Nathan's stomach sank. He had heard stories about neglect in some orphanages, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. The rain, the cold, and the state of the children all pointed to a deliberate abandonment. "How long were you at the orphanage?" Nathan asked gently. Jamie hesitated, his small shoulders hunching as if the question itself was too heavy to bear. "A long time," he murmured. "It wasn't a good place." Nathan's jaw tightened. He could see the pain in Jamie's eyes, the weight of experiences no child should have to carry. He wanted to press for more details, but he knew better than to push too hard. Jamie was already showing incredible bravery by speaking at all. "I'm sorry, Jamie," Nathan said quietly. "You didn't deserve any of that. And I promise I won't let anything bad happen to you or your sisters ever again." Jamie's eyes flicked up to meet Nathan's, a glimmer of hope breaking through the fear. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. Just then, Maria approached, her expression, a mix of concern and determination. "The twins are stable for now," she said, "but they're malnourished and exhausted. They'll need medical attention." Nathan nodded, his mind racing. He knew the next steps should involve contacting social services, but something deep inside him resisted. He couldn't bring himself to hand these children over to a system that had already failed them. As if sensing his hesitation, Jamie reached out and grabbed Nathan's hand. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't send us back, please." Nathan felt his heart shatter at the boy's plea. He crouched down again, placing a reassuring hand on Jamie's shoulder. "You're not going back there," he said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Maria raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. She had worked with Nathan long enough to know when his mind was made up. "I'll take them home with me tonight," Nathan said, standing up. "The roads are a mess with the storm, and social services won't get here until morning anyway." Maria hesitated. "You know this isn't exactly by the book, right?" "I know," Nathan replied, "but I can't leave them here. Not after what they've been through." Jamie's grip on his hand tightened, and Nathan glanced down to see the faintest hint of relief on the boy's face. "All right," Maria said, sighing. "I'll log it as temporary custody. But you'd better be prepared to answer some questions tomorrow." Nathan nodded, already bracing himself for the consequences. For now, all that mattered was getting the children somewhere safe. As he gathered Jamie and the twins, Nathan felt a strange sense of purpose stirring within him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was determined to protect these children with everything he had. The drive home felt like the longest of Nathan's life. The rain had slowed, but the streets remained slick, illuminated by the dim glow of streetlights. In the back seat, Jamie sat quietly, his small body wrapped in a borrowed blanket. He glanced at the twins, who were strapped into the car's rear-facing seats, their soft breathing barely audible over the hum of the engine. Nathan's hands gripped the steering wheel as his mind raced. He had made impulsive decisions before, but nothing like this. Bringing 3 children, strangers, into his home wasn't just bending protocol, it was shattering it. Yet every time he thought of leaving them in the care of a broken system, his resolve strengthened. When Nathan pulled into the driveway, the sight of the house hit him harder than usual. It was the same as always, modest and tidy, with the porch light glowing dimly in the misty night, but it felt like a shell of what it had once been. The laughter, warmth, and chaos of a happy family had disappeared the day their son, Caleb, passed. He turned off the engine and glanced back at Jamie. "We're here," he said gently. "Come on, let's get inside." Jamie nodded but didn't move until Nathan opened his door. The boys shuffled out, sticking close as Nathan carefully lifted the twins from their seats. They were so light, their tiny forms swaddled in the blankets Maria had given him at the station. Inside, the house was eerily silent, as it always was. Emma, his wife, rarely ventured out of their bedroom these days. Nathan knew she'd be furious when she found out what he'd done, but he couldn't worry about that now. The children needed a safe place to sleep tonight, and this was the best he could offer. Nathan led Jamie into the living room and gestured for him to sit on the couch. "I'll be right back," he said, keeping his voice low. He carried the twins to the guest room, where he laid them down side by side on the bed. The sight of their tiny faces, peaceful in sleep, stirred something in him, an ache that wasn't entirely pain but something deeper, almost like hope. After making sure they were secure, he returned to find Jamie sitting stiffly on the edge of the couch, his eyes darting around the room. "Are you hungry?" Nathan asked. Jamie hesitated, then nodded. Nathan disappeared into the kitchen and quickly put together a sandwich. He handed it to Jamie, who took it cautiously, as if afraid it might be taken away. Nathan sat down in the armchair across from him, watching as the boy devoured the food in a few quick bites. "Thank you," Jamie said softly, his voice barely audible. Nathan nodded. "You're welcome. You don't have to thank me, Jamie. You're safe here." The boy's eyes darted toward the hallway, where a faint creak of floorboards signaled Emma's presence. Nathan turned just in time to see her step into the living room, her expression a mixture of confusion and wariness. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose braid, and she wore the same sweater she'd had on for days, a testament to how little she cared about herself anymore. "Nathan," she began, her voice sharp despite its hoarseness. "What is this?" He stood, moving toward her as Jamie shrank back into the couch. "Emma, I can explain," he said quickly. "I found these kids out in the rain. They were abandoned. I couldn't just leave them." Emma's eyes flicked to Jamie and softened slightly before hardening again. "And you thought bringing them here was a good idea?" "They had nowhere else to go," Nathan replied, his voice firm. "Social services can't get involved until tomorrow, and they need a safe place tonight." Emma sighed, rubbing her temples. "Nathan, we're barely holding it together as it is. How do you expect us to handle this?" "I know it's a lot," he admitted. "But look at them." He gestured toward the hallway. "Those babies, they need someone to care for them. And Jamie, he's been through so much already." Emma glanced at Jamie again, who was watching her with wide, nervous eyes. For a moment her expression softened, then she straightened, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Fine," she said at last. "But just for tonight." Nathan exhaled, relief washing over him. "Thank you." Emma didn't respond, instead walking toward the guest room. She paused in the doorway, staring at the twins for a long moment. Nathan watched her carefully, wondering if the sight of the babies might stir something in her, some spark of the warmth and love she had buried deep inside. Finally, she turned back to him. "We'll talk about this in the morning," she said before retreating to their bedroom. Nathan returned to Jamie, who was now sitting with his knees pulled up to his chest. "It's okay," Nathan said gently. "She just needs time." Jamie nodded, though his expression remained uncertain. Nathan sat beside him, a quiet determination settling over him. No matter what happened tomorrow, he knew one thing: these children weren't going back to the life they had escaped. Morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden beams across the quiet house. Nathan woke with a start, his mind instantly replaying the events of the previous night. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream. But the faint sound of Jamie's voice in the living room reminded him it was all too real. He rose and made his way down the hall, pausing at the guest room. The twins were still fast asleep, bundled in the blankets Nathan had tucked around them. A small sense of relief washed over him. At least they were safe for now. In the living room, Jamie was sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing with a set of building blocks Nathan had dug out of storage. The boy's face was still etched with a faint wariness, but there was a spark of curiosity in his movements that Nathan hadn't seen before. "Good morning," Nathan said softly, not wanting to startle him. Jamie looked up and nodded. "Good morning," he replied quietly. "Are you hungry?" Nathan asked, moving toward the kitchen. Jamie hesitated, then nodded again. Nathan busied himself making breakfast, the familiar routine calming his racing thoughts. As he cooked, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him and turned to see Emma standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. "We need to talk," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. Nathan sighed, setting down the spatula. "I know." Emma stepped closer, lowering her voice to avoid being overheard. "Nathan, what's the plan here? We can't just keep them. What if social services decide to place them somewhere else? What happens then?" "I'm not letting them go back to the system," Nathan replied, his voice steady. "Jamie told me about the orphanage. Emma, it's worse than we thought." Her expression softened slightly. "What did he say?" Nathan glanced toward the living room, ensuring Jamie was out of earshot before speaking. "He said the woman running the orphanage, Harriet, abandoned them, just left them in the rain without looking back. And that place, it doesn't sound like somewhere any child should be." Emma's lips pressed into a thin line, and the conflict was evident in her eyes. She had always been a fiercely compassionate person, but grief had dulled that part of her. Now it seemed to flicker back to life, however faintly. "Let's hear him out," she said finally, surprising Nathan. "If he's willing to talk, we need to listen." Nathan nodded, grateful for her support. He returned to the living room with 2 plates of scrambled eggs and toast, handing one to Jamie before sitting down across from him. "Jamie," Nathan began gently, "can you tell us more about the orphanage? About what happened there?" Jamie froze, his fork hovering mid-air. He glanced nervously at Emma, who gave him a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay," she said softly. "We just want to understand." Jamie took a deep breath, his small shoulders rising and falling. "The orphanage? It's not a good place," he said slowly. "Harriet, the lady who runs it, she's mean. She yells at us, and sometimes she hurts us." Nathan felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. "What about the other kids?" he asked. "There were a lot of us," Jamie replied, "but some of them, they just disappeared. Harriet said they got adopted, but I don't think that's true." Emma's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Nathan leaned forward, his voice steady. "What do you mean, Jamie?" Jamie hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "She said no one wanted us because we weren't good enough," he murmured. "And then one day some of the kids were just gone. No one told us where they went." Nathan exchanged a grim look with Emma. Harriet's actions were more than just neglect. They bordered on something far darker. "What about your sisters?" Emma asked gently. "Did Harriet treat them the same way?" Jamie nodded, his small hands clenching into fists. "She didn't care about them because they're so little. She said they weren't worth anything." Nathan's stomach churned at the boy's words. He had heard of neglect and abuse in orphanages before, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. "Jamie," he said carefully, Do you remember anything else about the kids who disappeared? Did anyone ever visit the orphanage before they left? Jamie frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. Sometimes people came to see Harriet. They talked in her office, but we weren't allowed to go in there. After they left, some of the kids would be gone. Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't have all the pieces yet, but the picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't good. "Thank you for telling us," Emma said softly, placing a hand on Jamie's shoulder. "You're very brave." Jamie gave a small nod, his expression uncertain but grateful. As Nathan cleared the plates, he felt a growing sense of determination. Harriet wasn't just neglecting these children. She was hiding something much worse, and he was going to find out what. Nathan sat at his desk in the small police precinct, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead doing little to ease his focus. Before him was a stack of paperwork, a combination of records he had managed to pull from the system and handwritten notes from his conversation with Jamie. Each page felt like a breadcrumb leading him further into a dark, tangled web. The boy's words haunted him. Sometimes people came to see Harriet. After they left, some of the kids would be gone. Nathan leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. This wasn't just neglect. Harriet wasn't merely a cruel caretaker. She was part of something much larger and far more sinister. His research over the last few hours confirmed his worst fears. The orphanage, officially called Brighthaven Children's Refuge, had been operational for decades, but in recent years, its records had become suspiciously incomplete. There were adoption papers without follow-up reports, names of supposed families that didn't exist, and a troubling number of children who were listed as transferred with no explanation. Nathan had seen enough bureaucratic red tape in his career to know when something didn't add up. Harriet was covering her tracks, but she hadn't been careful enough. "Need a hand?" Nathan looked up to see his colleague, Ryan, leaning against the doorway. Ryan was a seasoned officer, one of the few Nathan trusted implicitly. "Could use a second pair of eyes," Nathan admitted, gesturing toward the pile of documents. Ryan stepped inside, his sharp gaze scanning the papers. "What's all this?" "Brighthaven," Nathan replied. "The orphanage. It's worse than I thought." Ryan frowned, flipping through a file. "What are we talking about here? Neglect? Abuse?" "More than that," Nathan said, his voice low. "The kids aren't just disappearing, they're being sold." Ryan froze, his expression darkening. "You're serious?" Nathan nodded grimly. "Harriet's running some kind of trafficking operation. She's using fake adoption papers to move kids off the books. Jamie said that the families visited the orphanage and talked to Harriet, and then the kids vanished. No follow-ups, no records, just gone." Ryan let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. "How has no one caught this before?" "She's careful," Nathan said, "but not careful enough. I've got names of supposed adoptive families that don't check out addresses that don't exist. It's all here. It just needs to be pieced together." Ryan pulled up a chair, his face set with determination. "Let's start piecing." The two men worked late into the evening, combing through every scrap of evidence. Slowly but surely, a pattern began to emerge. Harriet had been exploiting the orphanage's status as a charitable organization to funnel children into a black market adoption ring. Wealthy families, desperate for children but unwilling to navigate the legal adoption process, paid Harriet exorbitant sums to bypass the system. And for those children deemed undesirable, too old, too ill, or in the twins' case simply not marketable, there was no place. They were discarded like unwanted goods. Nathan's stomach churned as he connected the dots. He thought of Jamie's small, trembling frame and the way he had clung to his sisters in the rain. The boy had already endured more in his short life than most adults ever would. "This is big," Ryan said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "If we move too fast, she'll disappear. But if we wait too long, more kids will get hurt." "I know," Nathan replied, his jaw set. "That's why we need to do this right. I'm taking it to Jack tomorrow." Jack, their precinct's captain, was a man of integrity. If anyone could help them build a solid case against Harriet, it was him. That night, Nathan returned home to find Emma sitting in the living room with the twins. She had one of them cradled in her arms, gently rocking the baby as it dozed. Jamie sat nearby, stacking blocks with the quiet focus of a child who was beginning to feel safe for the first time in a long while. How's everyone doing? Nathan asked softly, setting his keys on the table. Emma looked up, her expression unreadable. They're settling in, she said. Jamie's still nervous, but he's talking more. And the twins, they're calmer now. Nathan nodded, sitting down beside her. He watched as Jamie placed the last block on his tower, a small smile flickering across his face. They deserve better, Nathan said quietly. Emma glanced at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. What did you find out? Harriet's running a trafficking ring, Nathan admitted. She's selling the kids to families who want to skip the legal process. And the ones she can't sell? He trailed off, his voice heavy with anger. Emma's face paled. How could someone do that? To children? I don't know, Nathan said, his fists clenching. But I'm going to stop her. Jack and I are putting together a case. We'll take her down. Emma placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm despite the tremor in her fingers. Be careful, Nathan, if she finds out you're on to her. She won't, he assured her. Not until it's too late. As the twins began to stir, Emma rose to tend to them, leaving Nathan alone with his thoughts. He watched Jamie carefully, noting the way the boy's shoulders were beginning to relax, his movements less guarded. It was a small victory, but one that fueled Nathan's determination. He wouldn't let Harriet, or anyone else, hurt these children again. The days that followed were unlike anything Nathan had experienced before. His home, which had once been quiet and heavy with grief, now buzzed with activity. The twins filled the air with soft coos and the occasional wail, while Jamie's presence brought a cautious energy that hinted at the resilience buried beneath his shy demeanor. For Emma, the adjustment was slower, but no less transformative. Nathan often found her sitting with the twins, holding them close as if afraid they might vanish. It had been years since he'd seen her interact so tenderly with anyone, and though her movements were hesitant at first, there was a flicker of life in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Nathan returned from work one afternoon to find Emma on the living room floor, stacking blocks with Jamie while the twins napped nearby. Jamie's laugh, a sound so rare it felt almost foreign, bubbled up as Emma made a tower collapse in mock frustration. Looks like I'm missing the fun, Nathan said, setting his bag down by the door. Emma looked up, a small smile tugging at her lips. Jamie's teaching me how to build a proper tower. Apparently, I've been doing it wrong all these years. Nathan chuckled, his chest warming at the sight of them together. For the first time in months, his house felt alive again. He knelt beside Jamie, ruffling the boy's hair. You're going to have to teach me too. I've never been much of a builder. Jamie grinned, his face lighting up with a brightness that caught Nathan off guard. It was a momentary glimpse of the carefree child Jamie could have been, and Nathan silently vowed to give him the chance to be that boy again. As the days turned into weeks, the small family began to settle into a routine. Emma took charge of caring for the twins, her maternal instincts reawakening with surprising ease. She had once been an incredible mother to Caleb, and though her grief for their son would never fully disappear, she now poured her love and attention into the two tiny lives that depended on her. Nathan watched in awe as Emma slowly came back to life. There were still moments when the weight of her sorrow pressed down on her, but those moments were fewer and farther between. The twins seemed to bring out a part of her she had thought lost forever, and Nathan found himself clinging to the hope that their family could heal together. Jamie, too, began to change. At first, he stayed close to Nathan, shadowing him through the house like a quiet guardian. But as time went on, he started to open up, his movements less cautious, his words more frequent. He began to play freely, building elaborate towers for the twins to knock over and drawing pictures that he proudly showed to Emma and Nathan. One evening, as Nathan sat at the kitchen table reviewing files on the orphanage, Jamie approached him hesitantly, clutching a piece of paper. I drew this for you, Jamie said softly, holding out the picture. Nathan took it carefully, his heart squeezing at the sight. It was a drawing of their family, Jamie, the twins, Nathan, and Emma, all holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. It's beautiful, Jamie, Nathan said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Jamie smiled shyly, his eyes shining with a mix of pride and uncertainty. Do you think we could be a real family? Nathan's throat tightened. He crouched down to Jamie's level, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We already are, Jamie," he said firmly. "You, your sisters, Emma and me were a family, and I promise I'll do everything I can to keep it that way." Jamie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but he nodded, his small frame relaxing just a little more. That night, as Nathan and Emma sat together on the couch, the twins asleep in their cribs and Jamie tucked into the spare bedroom, Nathan spoke quietly. "They've changed everything," he said, his gaze distant. "It's like they've brought something back that I thought we'd lost forever." Emma nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "It's not easy," she admitted. "Every time I look at them, I think of Caleb. But at the same time, they've given me something to hold on to. A reason to get out of bed in the morning." Nathan reached for her hand, his grip steady. "We're going to make this work. For them. For us." Emma leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I believe you," she whispered. As the house settled into quiet, Nathan allowed himself a moment of peace. He knew the challenges weren't over. Harriet was still out there, and the case against her was growing more complex by the day. But for now, he was content to sit in the warmth of his home, surrounded by the family he hadn't realized he so desperately needed. Nathan sat at his desk in the precinct, his laptop open to a spreadsheet of orphanage records he had pieced together from various sources. The names of children, dates of supposed adoptions, and the fabricated details of adoptive families blurred together as he stared at the screen. His gut told him there was more to uncover, and every moment he spent sifting through the evidence confirmed his suspicions. Brighthaven Children's Refuge wasn't just a place of neglect. It was a front for something far darker. Beside him, Ryan leaned over the desk, frowning at the pages of notes. "So we've got fake addresses, non-existent adoption agencies, and a whole lot of missing kids," Ryan said, his voice grim. "You think Harriet's behind all of it?" Nathan nodded, his jaw tightening. "She's not just running an abusive orphanage, she's selling these kids. That's why the records don't match up. She's falsifying adoption papers to hide where they're actually going and to whom." Ryan let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "How has she been getting away with this? There's no way this operation's been under the radar for so long without someone protecting her." "That's what worries me," Nathan admitted. "If she's got connections, this could go deeper than we thought." Ryan crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. "So what's the play? We can't just barge in there without solid proof. She'd lawyer up and vanish before we even got a warrant." Nathan rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I've already taken this to Jack. He's working with a few trusted officers to build a case, but it's slow going. We need more than suspicions and incomplete files." Ryan hesitated, then lowered his voice. "What about the kids you brought home? Jamie and the twins? Do they know anything that could help?" Nathan's stomach clenched. He hated the idea of pushing Jamie for more information, especially after how much the boy had already endured. But if there was any chance he could provide a crucial piece of the puzzle, Nathan had to try. That evening, back at home, Nathan sat on the couch beside Jamie, who was carefully assembling a puzzle. The boy had grown more comfortable in their house, but Nathan could still see traces of fear in his eyes whenever the past was mentioned. "Jamie," Nathan said gently, "can I ask you something about the orphanage?" Jamie froze, his small hands hovering over a puzzle piece. He looked up at Nathan, his expression guarded. "It's okay if you don't want to talk," Nathan reassured him. "But anything you can tell me might help us stop Harriet from hurting other kids." Jamie's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Nathan thought he wouldn't respond. But then the boy nodded slowly. She had a room," Jamie said hesitantly. "An office. We weren't allowed to go in there, but I saw her once. She had papers everywhere and a drawer she always kept locked." Nathan leaned forward, keeping his voice calm. "Do you know what was in the drawer?" Jamie shook his head. "No, but sometimes people came to see her. They'd go into her office, and when they left, some of the kids were gone." Nathan's heart sank. It was exactly what he had feared. Harriet was using her office as the nerve center of her operation, likely hiding incriminating evidence in plain sight. "Thank you, Jamie," Nathan said quietly. "You're very brave for telling me this." Jamie nodded again, his gaze dropping back to the puzzle. I don't want her to hurt anyone else." Nathan felt a surge of anger and determination. "She won't," he promised. "Not if I can help it." The next day, Nathan returned to the precinct, his resolve unshaken. He met with Jack and laid out everything Jamie had told him. "She's keeping records," Nathan said. "If we can get into that office, we might find exactly what we need to shut her down." Jack nodded, his expression serious. "It's risky. If we move too soon, she'll destroy the evidence or disappear. But if we wait too long, more kids will vanish," Nathan finished, his voice hard. Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, I'll put together a team. We'll plan this carefully, coordinate with child welfare, get a warrant, the works." But Nathan met his captain's gaze. "You'd better be sure," Jack said. "If this goes sideways, she'll walk and those kids will pay the price." "I'm sure," Nathan replied firmly. As the plan began to take shape, Nathan couldn't shake the image of Jamie's trembling hands as he described Harriet's office. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. Too many children were depending on him. That night, as Nathan and Emma sat together in the living room, he shared the details of the impending raid. Emma listened quietly, her hands cradling one of the twins as they slept. "Are you ready for this?" she asked softly. Nathan nodded, though the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his chest. "I have to be. For Jamie. For those kids." Emma reached out, placing her hand over his. "Just be careful. We can't lose you too." Nathan squeezed her hand, his gaze steady. "I promise," he said. "This ends here." The early morning mist clung to the ground as Nathan stood in the briefing room with Jack and a handful of trusted officers. The plan for the raid was laid out in detail, a precise, coordinated effort to ensure Harriet had no chance to escape or destroy evidence. The warrant had been secured late the previous night, and now, with the weight of justice behind them, they were ready to move. "This is our only shot," Jack said, his voice firm but calm as he addressed the team. "We need to find those records, every paper, every file, anything that connects her to the trafficking network. But most importantly, we're going in for the kids. No child leaves that building without being accounted for and safeguarded." Nathan nodded, his jaw set. He had spent the night going over the plan in his head, visualizing every possible scenario. Harriet wouldn't slip through their fingers, not this time. As the team loaded into their vehicles, the air was thick with anticipation. Nathan's mind kept drifting back to Jamie and the twins. The thought of Harriet discarding them like trash, deeming them worthless, fueled his determination. This wasn't just about stopping a criminal. It was about ensuring that no other child would have to endure what those three had suffered. The convoy of police cars pulled up to the orphanage's gates just as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the fog. The building stood silent and foreboding, its peeling paint and broken shutters a testament to the neglect within. "Move in," Jack ordered, and the officers sprang into action. The front door was breached in seconds, splintering under the force of a battering ram. Nathan was among the first to enter, his heart pounding as he scanned the dimly lit hallway. The smell of mildew and stale air hit him immediately, but he pushed it aside, his focus razor-sharp. "Check every room," Jack barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Nathan moved quickly, throwing open doors and clearing each space. The conditions were worse than he'd imagined. Moldy walls, broken furniture, and floors littered with discarded belongings. It was clear that the orphanage hadn't been a place of care for a long time. In one room, he found a group of children huddled together, their faces pale and frightened. "It's okay," Nathan said gently, lowering his voice. "We're here to help." The children stared at him, wide-eyed and silent, until one of the older girls nodded hesitantly. Nathan motioned for another officer to escort them outside to safety, his chest tightening at the thought of what they must have endured. As he continued down the hall, he spotted a familiar face. Harriet. She was attempting to slip out through a side door, her hands clutching a black bag. Nathan's heart leapt as he shouted, "Stop right there!" Harriet froze, her face twisting into a mask of anger and fear. "This is a mistake," she hissed. "You have no idea what you're doing." Nathan leveled his gaze at her, his voice cold. "I know exactly what I'm doing. It's over, Harriet." She made a desperate lunge for the door, but Nathan was faster. He grabbed her arm, yanking her back as another officer moved in to secure her in handcuffs. "You'll regret this," she screamed, her voice shrill as she struggled against their grip. "You have no proof?" Nathan didn't respond, his focus shifting to the black bag she had tried to take with her. He opened it, his stomach sinking, as he found stacks of cash, falsified adoption records, and photographs of children, evidence of the horrifying network she had been running. Jack appeared at his side, his expression grim as he glanced at the bag. "That's all we need," he said quietly. Nathan nodded, his grip tightening on the bag. "Let's finish this." The search continued, and room by room, they found more children, malnourished, terrified, but alive. Each rescue fueled Nathan's resolve, but his anger simmered beneath the surface. How had Harriet gotten away with this for so long? In a locked storage room, they discovered what Nathan had feared most: makeshift cells where the youngest children were kept, likely waiting to be sold. The sight made his blood boil, but he forced himself to stay composed. There would be time for anger later. Right now, the priority was getting the kids out safely. By the time the raid concluded, Harriet was in custody, and every child in the orphanage had been accounted for. Paramedics tended to the children, wrapping them in blankets and checking their vital signs as officers escorted them to waiting vehicles. Nathan stood outside the orphanage, watching the scene unfold. Despite the victory, a heavy sadness settled over him. The horrors these children had endured wouldn't disappear overnight. Jack approached him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Nathan," he said. "This wouldn't have happened without you." Nathan nodded, though the weight of the day was still pressing on him. "I just hope it's enough," he said quietly. Later that night, Nathan returned home. The house was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the orphanage's cold, oppressive walls. Emma was in the living room with the twins, who babbled happily in her arms. Jamie sat nearby, building yet another block tower. "They're safe," Nathan said simply as he entered. Emma looked up, her eyes searching his face. "And Harriet?" "She's in custody," he replied. "We got everything we need to put her away for a long time." Jamie's head lifted, his expression hopeful. "So, she can't hurt anyone anymore?" Nathan knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No, Jamie, she can't." The boy's face softened, and for the first time Nathan saw a hint of peace in his eyes. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional shuffle of papers and the faint whispers of onlookers. Nathan sat in the back row, his gaze fixed on Harriet, who sat at the defendant's table with a cold, detached expression. She was no longer the commanding figure who had terrorized so many lives. Now, she was simply a woman caught in the trap of her own evil deeds. The weeks leading up to the trial had been grueling. Nathan, along with Jack and the team, had worked tirelessly to prepare the case against Harriet. The evidence they'd uncovered during the raid, the falsified records, the hidden cash, the photographs had been damning, but it was the testimonies of the children that would ultimately seal her fate. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Susan, stood confidently as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you will hear today is the story of manipulation, abuse, and greed. Harriet Kane used her position as director of Bright Haven Children's Refuge not to protect vulnerable children, but to exploit them. She sold them to the highest bidder, treating their lives as commodities." Nathan clenched his fists as Susan spoke, his jaw tightening. He knew this was necessary, but hearing the truth laid out so plainly was like reopening an old wound. The first witness was a former staff member from the orphanage, a woman named Linda. She had worked there for several years before leaving in disgust at what she had seen. "Harriet was controlling," Linda said, her voice shaking slightly as she recalled the past. "She kept everything locked up: records, money, even the children. She said it was for their safety, but we all knew that wasn't true. And when families came to adopt, it wasn't normal. They didn't go through any of the usual processes. They just left with the kids." The prosecutor pressed further. "And did you ever report this to anyone?" Linda hesitated, guilt flashing across her face. "I tried, but Harriet always found out. She had connections, and people who could make complaints disappeared. I was afraid. I'm still afraid." Her words sent a murmur through the courtroom. Nathan could see the jurors' faces hardening as they absorbed the gravity of Harriet's actions. When Jamie took the stand, Nathan felt his chest tighten. The boy looked small and nervous in the oversized chair, his hands clutching the edge of the table. Nathan exchanged a reassuring glance with him, silently willing him to stay strong. "Jamie," the prosecutor said gently, "can you tell us about your time at Bright Haven?" Jamie's voice was barely above a whisper as he began. "It wasn't a nice place. Harriet didn't like us. She said we were bad kids, that no one wanted us, and then some of the kids started disappearing." "Disappearing?" Susan asked. Jamie nodded, his small hands trembling. "She said they were adopted, but I don't think that's true. They just left, and no one ever came back." The prosecutor's voice softened. "Jamie, do you remember what happened the night you were abandoned?" Jamie hesitated, his eyes darting toward Nathan for reassurance. Nathan gave him a small nod, and the boy took a deep breath. "She put me and my sisters in the car," he said slowly. "She drove us to a street and told me to wait. Then she left. It was raining, and my sisters were crying, but she didn't come back." The courtroom was silent as Jamie's words hung in the air. Even Harriet, who had maintained her stoic expression throughout the trial, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. By the time the closing arguments were made, Nathan felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Susan's final words were clear and damning. Harriet Kane's actions were not only criminal, but inhumane. She preyed on the most vulnerable members of our society, children who had no one to protect them. It is your duty to ensure she never has the chance to harm another child again. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Nathan sat in the courtroom as the judge handed down Harriet's sentence, a lengthy prison term that ensured she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. While it wasn't enough to undo the harm she had caused, it was a victory for the children she had exploited. As Harriet was led away in handcuffs, Nathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice had been served, but his mind was already turning to the children she had left behind. They had been saved, but their journey to healing was only beginning. That evening, Nathan returned home to find Jamie waiting for him by the window. "Did she get in trouble?" Jamie asked softly. Nathan knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "She won't hurt anyone ever again," he said firmly. Jamie's lips curved into a small smile, and for the first time, Nathan saw a glimmer of peace in the boy's eyes. As the twins babbled in the background and Emma joined them, Nathan felt a sense of closure. Harriet was gone, but the future still held challenges and hope for the family they were building together. The weeks following Harriet's sentencing were marked by a bittersweet calm. The storm had passed, but its aftermath was still visible in the quiet moments. The way Jamie sometimes woke in the middle of the night, trembling from a nightmare, or the way the twins clung to Emma as if sensing she was their safe harbor. Nathan knew their journey was far from over. While Harriet could no longer harm anyone, the scars she had left on these children would take time to heal. Still, there was something undeniably hopeful about their home now. One crisp morning, Nathan found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The twins were napping in their cribs, and Jamie was outside in the backyard, carefully stacking rocks into a tower. "Quiet morning," Nathan said as he joined her, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Emma nodded, her gaze distant. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment. "About?" Nathan asked, though he had a feeling he already knew. Emma took a deep breath. "About the future. About Jamie and the twins. Nathan, I can't imagine our lives without them anymore." Nathan leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink in. He had been having the same thoughts for weeks, but hadn't found the right moment to bring them up. "They've changed everything," Emma continued, her voice soft but steady. "They've given us a reason to hope again. And I don't want to lose them." Nathan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I don't either," he said firmly. "They're already part of our family. I think it's time we made it official." Emma's eyes widened slightly, her fingers tightening around his. "Are you saying adoption?" Nathan nodded. "Yes, I know it won't be easy, but they deserve a stable, loving home, and I want to be the one to give them that." Tears filled Emma's eyes, but she smiled, a glimmer of happiness shining through the emotion. "I do too," she said, her voice trembling. The decision to adopt brought a renewed sense of purpose to their lives. But it also came with challenges. The legal process was daunting, especially given the complicated history of the orphanage. Many of the children's records were incomplete or falsified, and the case against Harriet had left a trail of bureaucratic red tape. Nathan and Emma spent countless hours filling out forms, attending interviews, and meeting with caseworkers. Every step was a reminder of how fragile the system could be, and how close Jamie and the twins had come to slipping through its cracks. One evening, as Nathan reviewed yet another stack of paperwork at the kitchen table, Jamie wandered in, clutching a drawing in his hand. "What's that?" Nathan asked, setting down his pen. Jamie hesitated for a moment before handing it over. The drawing was simple but heartfelt, a picture of their family, with Nathan, Emma, Jamie, and the twins all holding hands under a bright sun. "I wanted to give this to you," Jamie said quietly. Nathan smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you, Jamie. It's beautiful." Jamie shuffled his feet nervously. Do you think we'll always be a family?" Nathan knelt down to Jamie's level, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "We already are," he said gently, "and we're going to make it official. Would you like that?" Jamie's eyes widened. "You mean you're going to adopt us?" Nathan nodded, his voice filled with certainty. "Yes, Jamie. You, your sisters, all of you. We want you to stay with us forever." Jamie's face lit up with a joy Nathan hadn't seen before. He threw his arms around Nathan, hugging him tightly. "Thank you," he whispered. Nathan held him close, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. The road to adoption wasn't smooth, but Nathan and Emma faced each challenge with determination. They attended home visits and answered endless questions about their intentions, their finances, and their ability to provide a stable environment for the children. Through it all, Jamie continued to thrive. He started talking more, playing more, and even helping Emma care for the twins. It was as if the promise of a permanent home had given him the courage to let go of some of his fears. The twins, meanwhile, were growing rapidly. Their laughter filled the house, a joyful sound that seemed to erase the shadows of the past. Emma devoted herself to their care, and Nathan often found her singing softly to them, a serene expression on her face that reminded him of the woman she had been before Caleb's death. "You're amazing," Nathan told her one evening as they watched the twins play on the floor. Emma smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "So are you," she replied. "We're doing this together." Months later, the family stood in a courtroom once again, but this time the atmosphere was filled with hope instead of tension. Nathan and Emma sat on one side of the room, with Jamie and the twins beside them. The judge, a kind-looking woman with a gentle smile, reviewed the final documents. "Nathan and Emma Hayes," she said, looking up at them, "it's clear that you've provided these children with a home filled with love and stability. I'm pleased to finalize the adoption today." Nathan felt Emma's hand tighten in his, and he glanced at Jamie, whose face glowed with happiness. "Jamie, Lily, and Grace Hayes," the judge continued, addressing the children. "Congratulations, you're officially part of this family now." Tears filled Nathan's eyes as the judge signed the papers, sealing their fate as a family. Jamie turned to Nathan, his voice filled with emotion. "Does this mean you're really my dad now?" Nathan knelt beside him, his voice thick with tears. "I've always been your dad, Jamie, and I always will be." The courtroom buzzed softly with murmured conversations as Nathan adjusted his tie, glancing at Emma. She sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jamie sat to her right, fidgeting with the hem of his neatly ironed shirt, while the twins, Lily and Grace, babbled happily in their car seats on the floor beside them. Today was the day their family became official. Nathan felt a strange mix of emotions, excitement, relief, and an undercurrent of disbelief. It had been a long, grueling process, but now, with the final papers in the judge's hands, the end was in sight. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," the court clerk called, drawing their attention. Nathan and Emma stood, gently guiding Jamie to his feet. Nathan carried Lily while Emma carried Grace, and together they walked toward the front of the courtroom. Jamie clung to Nathan's side, his small hand gripping tightly to his adoptive father's. The judge, an older man with kind eyes and a warm smile, motioned for them to take their seats. "Good morning," he began, flipping through the neatly bound stack of documents before him. "Today is a special day for your family." Nathan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Emma gave a small smile, her grip on Grace tightening slightly. The judge leaned forward, his gaze softening as he addressed Jamie. "Young man, do you know what's happening here today?" Jamie hesitated, glancing up at Nathan for reassurance. Nathan gave him a gentle nod, encouraging him to speak. "We're becoming a family," Jamie said softly, his voice steady despite his nerves. "That's exactly right," the judge replied with a smile. "And how do you feel about that?" Jamie's lips curved into a shy smile. "Happy." The judge chuckled warmly, flipping to the final page of the documents. "Well, Jamie, Lily, and Grace, let me officially welcome you into the Hayes family." He picked up his pen and signed the papers with a firm flourish, the sound of the ink scratching against the page ringing out in the quiet room. "From this moment forward, you are legally and permanently a part of this family." Book moment felt surreal. Emma let out a soft, trembling breath, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at Nathan. He reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly as he fought to keep his own emotions in check. Jamie's face lit up with a smile so radiant that it seemed to brighten the entire room. "Does this mean you're really my dad now?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Nathan knelt down, placing both hands on Jamie's shoulders. His voice was thick with emotion as he replied, "I've always been your dad, Jamie, and now it's official." Jamie threw his arms around Nathan, holding on tightly. Nathan hugged him back, closing his eyes as the moment overwhelmed him. Emma knelt beside them, pulling Jamie into her embrace as well. "We're so proud of you," she whispered, her voice trembling with love and gratitude. The twins, oblivious to the significance of the moment, giggled and reached for Nathan's tie. He laughed softly, kissing their foreheads as Emma wiped her tears. As the family stood for a photograph, the courtroom staff applauded, a ripple of warmth and joy spreading through the room. The judge, now standing beside them, leaned down to shake Jamie's hand. "Take care of your mom and dad, okay?" he said with a wink. Jamie nodded seriously. "I will." With the paperwork completed, Nathan and Emma gathered their children and walked out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air. The sun was shining brightly, its warmth chasing away the last remnants of winter's chill. "Are we really going to celebrate now?" Jamie asked eagerly, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Of course," Nathan replied with a grin. "What's a family celebration without ice cream?" Jamie's laughter rang out, free and unrestrained as they made their way to the car. That evening, the house was filled with the sounds of laughter and joy. Balloons and streamers adorned the living room, and a cake sat proudly on the kitchen counter, with the words, "Welcome home," written in frosting. Jamie helped Emma light the candles, his hands steady as he carefully placed each one. Nathan held Lily, while Grace babbled excitedly in her high chair, her tiny hands reaching for the decorations. "Make a wish," Nathan said as they prepared to cut the cake. Jamie closed his eyes tightly, his lips moving as he silently made his wish. When he opened them, his smile was brighter than ever. "What did you wish for?" Emma asked playfully. Jamie shrugged, a mischievous glint in his eye. "I don't have to tell you. It already came true." That night, after the children were tucked into bed, Nathan and Emma sat on the couch, their hands intertwined as they watched the flickering light of the fireplace. "We did it," Emma said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Nathan nodded, his gaze distant but peaceful. "Yeah, we did." The silence that followed wasn't heavy or strained, it was filled with quiet contentment. They had fought for this family, for these children, and now they were finally whole. Nathan glanced toward the hallway, where Jamie's door stood slightly ajar, the soft sound of his breathing carrying into the living room. The twins slept soundly in their cribs, their tiny forms safe and warm. For the first time in what felt like years, Nathan allowed himself to relax completely. The Hayes family was official now, but more than that, they were home. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, bathing the Hayes family's home in a golden glow. The quiet hum of a new day was accompanied by soft giggles and tiny footsteps pattering down the hall. Jamie was the first to appear in the kitchen, his tousled hair sticking up in all directions as he rubbed his sleepy eyes. "Good morning, buddy," Nathan greeted, flipping pancakes at the stove. Jamie smiled, climbing onto one of the stools at the counter. "Morning, Dad." The words still filled Nathan with a deep sense of pride and warmth every time Jamie said it. It was a simple word, but it carried so much weight, a reflection of everything they had overcome to become a family. Moments later, Emma entered the kitchen carrying Lily in one arm and Grace in the other. The twins were wide awake and already babbling enthusiastically. Emma set them down in their high chairs, her face glowing with a quiet happiness that Nathan hadn't seen in years. "Smells good," she said, leaning over to kiss Nathan on the cheek. "Special breakfast for a special day," Nathan replied, sliding a stack of pancakes onto a plate and setting it in front of Jamie. Jamie's eyes lit up as he dug into his breakfast, pausing only to make funny faces at the twins, who giggled in response. The room was filled with laughter and the comforting sounds of a family finally at peace. Bookmark. Go back. Later that morning, Nathan stood in the backyard watching as Jamie played with the twins. The boy had taken on his role as an older brother with remarkable ease, his natural kindness shining through in the way he guided the twins as they toddled after him. "Careful, Lily," Jamie said, steadying her as she stumbled over a patch of grass. "There you go." Nathan leaned against the porch railing, his arms crossed as he took in the scene. For so long, this backyard had been a place of silence and sadness, a reminder of what he and Emma had lost. But now it was alive with laughter and the sounds of a new beginning. Emma joined him, a cup of coffee in hand. "They're happy," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the children. "They are," Nathan agreed. "And so are we." Emma glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Do you think Caleb would have liked them?" Nathan's chest tightened at the mention of their son, but he nodded. He would have loved them, especially Jamie. He always wanted a little brother to play with. Emma's smile grew, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I think he'd be proud of us." Nathan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I know he would." As the day went on, the Hayes family settled into their new rhythm. Nathan spent the afternoon teaching Jamie how to throw a baseball, while Emma chased the twins around the yard. The simple moments, the kind they had once taken for granted, now felt like treasures. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nathan and Emma tucked the children into bed. The twins fell asleep almost immediately, their tiny hands clutching their favorite stuffed animals. Jamie, however, was still wide awake, staring up at the ceiling with a thoughtful expression. "Can't sleep?" Nathan asked, sitting on the edge of Jamie's bed. Jamie shook his head. "I was just thinking." "About what?" Jamie hesitated before speaking. "About the orphanage, about the other kids who were there." Nathan's heart ached at the words. Even now, after everything, Jamie was still thinking of others. "They're safe now," Nathan said gently. "They're getting help, just like you." Jamie nodded, but his brow furrowed slightly. "I hope they find families too, like I did." Nathan smiled, leaning down to ruffle Jamie's hair. "They will, and if they're half as lucky as we are, they'll find a family just as amazing as ours." Jamie's lips curved into a small smile, and he shifted under the covers. "Good night, Dad," he murmured. "Good night, Jamie," Nathan replied, his voice thick with emotion. Later, Nathan and Emma sat together on the couch, the quiet of the evening wrapping around them like a warm blanket. The fireplace crackled softly, casting a golden glow across the room. "We've come a long way," Emma said, breaking the silence. Nathan nodded, his gaze distant but peaceful. "We have, and I wouldn't trade any of it for the world." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither would I." As they sat together, their home finally felt complete. The journey to this point had been filled with heartache, challenges, and uncertainty, but it had also been filled with love, resilience, and hope. Nathan thought of the night he had found Jamie and the twins in the rain. He could never have imagined then how much those 3 children would change his life. They had given him and Emma something they had thought lost forever, the chance to heal, to love, and to build a future filled with possibility. As the fire burned low and the house settled into silence, Nathan closed his eyes, a sense of profound peace washing over him. This wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he had chosen, a life he would fight for every day. Because now, he had a family, and for Nathan Hayes, that was everything. The story of Nathan, Emma, Jamie, and the twins is not just a tale of finding hope and love again. It's a profound reminder of the power of compassion. From a family shattered by grief, they open their hearts to 3 abandoned children, giving them a home filled with warmth and care. The greatest lesson from this story is that resilience and love can heal even the deepest wounds. No matter how tough life's challenges may seem, when we come together, there's always a way forward. It also shows us that family isn't solely defined by blood. It's built on understanding, empathy, and the commitment to protect and cherish one another. Nathan's choice to act, even in the face of immense challenges, didn't just save those children, but also restored the spirit of his family. If you think this story was good, comment 1. If you think it was amazing, comment 2. And don't hesitate to share your own stories with us. What has inspired you? What moments have changed your life? Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another inspiring story. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.